The security guard's hand closed around Marcus Webb's arm before he'd even finished pulling out the chair for his daughter. Around them, forks paused over plates. Conversations dropped to whispers. A woman in pearls at the next table leaned toward her husband and said something behind her napkin that made him smirk. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He looked down at his daughter Ellie, who was still holding the little paper crown she'd brought from home because it was her birthday and she'd wanted to wear it somewhere fancy, and he saw her face fold in on itself the way a flower does when you close your hand around it. That was the only thing that came close to breaking him. The woman who'd ordered the guard over was named Vivian Cross. She stood near the hostess stand in a cream blazer that cost more than Marcus made in 2 weeks. Her arms crossed, her chin tilted at an angle she'd probably practiced. She didn't know his name. She didn't ask it. To Plen, she looked at his work boots, still dusted with drywall powder, and his faded company polo, and she'd already decided everything she needed to know about him. "This is a fine dining establishment," she said loud enough for the tables around them to hear, because the volume was the point. "We have a dress code. And frankly, sir, you're an embarrassment to my clientele." Marcus looked at her for a long moment, long enough that a couple of people at the bar turned to watch. Then he crouched down, gently took the paper crown from his daughter's hands, and set it back on her head himself, adjusting it so it sat straight. "Happy birthday, baby," he said quietly. "We'll get pizza instead. Pizza's better, anyway." He picked up her little pink backpack, took her hand, and walked out past the pearl necklace woman, past the maitre d' who wouldn't meet his eyes, past the golden lettering on the glass double doors that read Cross and Vine, Est, by Eleanor Cross. He didn't slam the door. He didn't curse. He just walked out into the cold evening with his daughter's hand in his, and if you'd been standing on that sidewalk, you might have thought you were looking at a man who'd just lost something. You would have been wrong, because 6 months earlier, through a holding company that didn't carry his name anywhere on its paperwork, Marcus Webb had bought the building that restaurant sat inside and the block it sat on. And by tomorrow morning, Vivian Cross was going to learn exactly whose building she'd just thrown a paying customer out of. If you've ever been looked down on by somebody who had no idea what you were actually capable of, somebody who judged you by your clothes, your job, your bank balance on paper instead of the one that mattered, then you already know there's something coming for Vivian Cross that she is not prepared for. Stay with this one until the end. It's worth it. 6 months before that night, Marcus Webb had been standing in an empty unit, 3 doors down from Cross, and Vine running a laser level along a wall stud, checking it twice the way he checked everything twice. He was 41 years old, built like a man who worked with his hands because he did, and he owned a small commercial renovation and property maintenance company that had exactly 9 employees and a spotless reputation in a 15-mile radius. Webb Restoration didn't advertise. It didn't need to. People who owned buildings around here passed his number to each other the way people pass down a good doctor. What none of them knew, because Marcus had never seen a reason to tell them, was that 4 years earlier he'd sold a small logistics software patent. He'd built as a side project to a company that used it to save $11 million a year in freight routing. The payout wasn't the kind of money that changes a man's face. It was the kind that changes what's possible for him, quietly in the background, while the man himself keeps wearing the same boots to work. Marcus hadn't bought a boat. He hadn't bought a bigger house. He'd bought commercial real estate, slowly, carefully, through a holding company called Ridgeline Partners that existed on paper and nowhere else. Because Marcus had learned a long time ago that money changes how people treat you, and he didn't want to be treated any differently than he already was. He wanted to keep fixing what was broken with his own 2 hands. He wanted his daughter to grow up. Watching him do that. Ellie was 7. Her mother had died when Ellie was 2. An aneurysm, sudden, the kind of thing nobody sees coming, and nobody ever fully stops flinching from. Since then, it had been the 2 of them, and Marcus had built his entire life around a single, unshakable principle that whatever he did, wherever he worked, whatever building he owned or didn't own, Ellie came first, and he would never let money or pride change the shape of who he was to her. That was the wall stud he was checking that afternoon in the empty unit. Ridgeline Partners had closed on the entire block 8 weeks earlier, an aging strip of commercial buildings that included Cross and Vine, 2 boutique clothing stores, a shuttered jewelry shop, and the mixed-use apartments above them. The previous owner, an elderly man named Nathaniel Pierce, who'd inherited the block from his father, had been renting to Cross and Vine at nearly half of market rate for 11 years, a personal arrangement that had never been revisited because Nathaniel liked the restaurant's original owner and never bothered to update the lease. Marcus hadn't touched the rent when he bought the block. He didn't touch rents casually. It wasn't his way. He'd planned to let the current lease run its natural course, due for renewal in 6 months, and negotiate a market rate adjustment then, the way any responsible property owner would. That was the plan before his daughter's birthday. Ellie had been talking about Cross and Vine for 2 months. She'd seen it on a cooking show. Rerun, the pastry chef there, had been on some regional finalist episode. And Ellie, who had exactly one culinary opinion in the entire world, which was that chocolate lava cake was the greatest achievement of human civilization, had declared that she wanted to go there for her 7th birthday. Just once. Just to see it. Marcus had made the reservation himself using his own name, no company name attached, because he never used the Ridgeline name for anything personal. He'd put on his cleanest work clothes because he'd come straight from a job site, fixing a burst pipe for an elderly tenant who couldn't wait until Monday, and he figured he'd have time to go home and change before dinner. He didn't. The pipe took longer than expected. Ellie had been so excited checking the clock that he hadn't had the heart to make her wait through him, showering and changing when they were already running close. He figured a nice restaurant would understand a paying customer showing up a little worn from an honest day's work. He figured wrong. Vivian Cross had inherited Cross and Vine 3 years earlier when her mother, Eleanor Cross, the woman whose name was etched in gold on the door, had stepped back from daily operations following a stroke that left her with limited mobility but an entirely unclouded mind. Eleanor had built the restaurant over 30 years from a single dining room with 12 tables into a regional institution, and she'd built it on a philosophy she'd said out loud to every employee she ever hired. We feed people. All people. That's the whole business. Vivian had absorbed none of it. She'd absorbed the marble countertops, the wine cellar, the awards on the wall, and she'd absorbed exactly one lesson from watching her mother run things, which was that the restaurant's reputation was a kind of currency, and currency needed to be protected from anything that might devalue it. In Vivian's mind, a man in work boots and a dusty polo, sitting in her dining room, was a devaluation. It didn't matter that his money spent the same as anyone else's. It mattered what the tables around him would think and what they would post and what the restaurant's polished image account might have to explain later. She had ordered him out inside of 90 seconds of seeing him. She hadn't asked his name. She hadn't checked the reservation. She'd looked at him and made her decision the way people who've never had to work with their hands often do, instantly and completely, mistaking appearance for information. Marcus and Ellie got pizza that night, a little corner place 2 blocks from Cross and Vine, with red vinyl booths and a jukebox that didn't work anymore but still lit up. Ellie wore her paper crown the entire meal. By the time the cheese pizza arrived, she was laughing again, and Marcus watched her laugh and felt something in his chest settle back into place. The particular relief of watching a wound close before its scars. He didn't tell her what he owned. He didn't tell her what was coming. He just watched his daughter eat pizza in a paper crown, and he made a decision, the way he made every decision, quietly, without announcing it to anyone, least of all himself. The next morning at 9 o'clock, Vivian Cross's office phone rang. It was Denise, her general manager, sounding confused. "There's a letter here from the property management office. It's about the lease renewal." "The renewal isn't for 6 months, Vivian said, not looking up from her laptop. "They're saying it's effective in 10 days. And Vivian, the number is not what we're paying now. It's not close." Vivian took the letter into her own hands 20 minutes later and read it once, quickly, the way you read something you expect to be a mistake. Then she read it a second time slower, checking every line for the error that had to be there. Then she read it a third time, and this time her hands were not quite steady because there was no error. The rent had been tripled. Effective in 10 days. Signed by the property manager of Ridgeline Partners LLC, a name she'd never heard of, on a letterhead she didn't recognize for a building she'd assumed, the way people assume things they've never had to check, would always belong to the quiet old man who liked her mother and never raised the rent. She called the number listed. A polite receptionist informed her that the property manager could see her the following afternoon and that walk-ins were discouraged, though given the account history, an exception could be made. Vivian did not wait for an appointment. She got in her car that same afternoon. The property management office for Ridgeline Partners occupied a modest second-floor suite 4 blocks away. Nothing like the marble and brass she was used to. Plain carpet, a simple reception desk, framed certifications on the wall rather than art. Vivian walked in already, talking the way she did in her own restaurant when she wanted a room to understand who was in charge of it. "I need to speak to whoever authorized this rent increase. This is not how legitimate business is conducted. This kind of predatory practice, tripling a long-standing tenant's rent with 10 days' notice, that's the sort of thing that ends up in front of a judge, and frankly, in front of a reporter. Because I have relationships with people who would be very interested in a story about a slumlord holding company squeezing a beloved local restaurant out of business." The receptionist, unbothered, gestured toward a closed door. "He can see you now, actually. Go ahead." Vivian pushed the door open already, midway through a sentence about her attorney, and stopped. Marcus Webb sat behind the desk in a charcoal suit that fit him the way suits fit men who'd had them properly tailored, not the way suits fit men who bought them off a rack for a wedding. His hands were folded on the desk in front of him, and he looked at her with the same quiet, unreadable expression he'd had the night before when the guard's hand closed around his arm. Behind him, in a simple black frame, hung a child's crayon drawing, a cake with 7 candles, a little girl with a paper crown drawn in careful, proud detail. Underneath, in a 7-year-old's crooked handwriting, "Happy birthday to me, love, Ellie." Vivian's mouth had gone completely dry. "You," she said. "Me," Marcus said. Nobody moved for a moment. Somewhere behind Vivian, the receptionist quietly closed the door. "I don't understand," Vivian said, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she genuinely didn't. Her mind was doing the work of trying to force 2 incompatible pictures into the same frame: the man in the dusty polo shirt she'd had thrown out of her restaurant, and the man now sitting behind a desk that controlled her entire livelihood. "But Ridgeline Partners bought this block 8 months ago," Marcus said. His voice was even unhurried, the voice of a man reading measurements off a level rather than delivering a verdict. "I'm the majority owner. I don't usually get involved with day-to-day management decisions. I do them personally when I feel like it matters." "You own the building," Vivian said, mostly to herself, testing the sentence to see if saying it out loud made it easier to believe. "I own the block," Marcus said. "Cross and Vine included." Vivian sat down without being asked to, in the chair across from the desk, because her legs had made the decision before she had. "The rent increase," she said. "That's retaliation. It's a market rate adjustment," Marcus said. "Your lease has been below market for 11 years because the previous owner liked your mother." "I don't dislike your mother. I've never met her, but I'm not required to keep subsidizing a business owned by someone who threw a paying customer and his 7-year-old daughter out of her restaurant for wearing the wrong clothes." That's not. Vivian started and stopped, because she could hear how it was going to sound before she finished it. "I've been renting to businesses for 11 years, Marcus said. "I've never once cared what my tenants' customers wear. I care whether they pay their bills, treat their staff decently, and don't do anything that embarrasses the block. Last night, one of my tenants embarrassed the block in front of 30 witnesses. On a night my daughter had been looking forward to for 2 months. Vivian felt heat rising in her face. The particular heat of being caught in a mistake that was about to become extremely expensive. "If I had known." "That's the problem," Marcus said, cutting her off, not unkindly but firmly, the way you'd stop someone before they said something that would make things worse. "You didn't need to know who I was to treat me decently. You needed to treat me decently because I was a person sitting in your restaurant with my kid. The moment you needed to know I owned the building before you decided I deserved respect, you'd already failed the only test that mattered." Vivian said nothing. There wasn't a version of the sentence she could form that made her look less exposed than she already felt. "I'm not evicting you," Marcus continued. "I'm not trying to run you out of business. Your mother built something real in that space, from what I understand, And I have no interest in destroying 30 years of somebody's work over a rent adjustment. But the rate is the rate. It's what every other tenant on this block pays per square foot. If Cross and Vine can't make that work, that's a conversation about your business model, not about me being unfair. 10 days is not enough time to restructure a budget like this, Vivian said. And for the first time there was something under the anger, something that sounded almost like pleading, though she'd have denied it if asked. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He looked at her the way he looked at a wall, before deciding where to put the first nail, patient, assessing, unwilling to move until he understood exactly what he was working with. "I'll give you 60 days at the current rate to transition, if you want it," he said finally. "Not because you've earned it. Because it's the reasonable thing to do, and I try to do the reasonable thing even when I don't especially want to. But I want something in return." "What?" "I want to understand how a restaurant that survived on a philosophy of feeding everyone turned into a restaurant that throws people out for their zip code," Marcus said. "Because I don't think your mother built it that way. I think somebody changed it after she stopped watching." Vivian's jaw tightened, an old, defensive reflex, but underneath it, something in her had already started to loosen the way a knot does when you finally stop pulling against it and let someone else look at how it's tied. 2 days later, Vivian did something she hadn't done in over a year. She drove out to the assisted living facility where her mother now lived, a quiet, well-kept place 40 minutes outside the city, and she sat across from Eleanor Cross in the small sitting room that overlooked a garden. Eleanor could no longer walk through unassisted but still insisted on facing. Eleanor's right side moved slower than her left, a permanent souvenir of the stroke, but her eyes were sharp, and they'd always been sharper than Vivian's, even now. "You look like you've been carrying something," Eleanor said. Before Vivian had said a word, Vivian told her everything. The restaurant, the man, the daughter, the crown, the rent, the office, the drawing on the wall. She expected her mother to be angry about the rent increase. She expected sympathy, or at least solidarity, mother to daughter, business to business. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment after Vivian finished. Then she reached over with her stronger hand and picked up a photograph from the side table, one Vivian had seen 100 times without ever really looking at it. It was Eleanor, decades younger, standing in the doorway of Cross and Vine on its opening night, arms around 2 people in simple aprons, no makeup, no polish, just 3 tired, happy faces. "Do you know who these 2 are?" Eleanor asked. Vivian shook her head. "Dishwashers," Eleanor said. "I couldn't afford waitstaff that first year. I washed dishes some nights myself. There was a night, maybe 8 months in, a man came into that restaurant in his work clothes, straight off a construction shift, tired, hungry, alone. Some of my regulars complained, said he didn't belong. I told them the door was open to anyone whose money was good and whose manners were decent, and if that offended them, they were welcome to eat somewhere else." She set the photograph down. "I built that restaurant so no one would ever feel the way I felt walking into rooms where I clearly didn't belong, back when I had nothing," Eleanor said. "I built it as the opposite of that feeling. Somewhere along the way you decided it was a fortress instead of a door. I don't know when that happened. I think I stopped paying close enough attention to catch it." "So, you're saying I was wrong," Vivian said, quietly. "I'm saying your rent problem isn't really a rent problem," Eleanor said. "It's a mirror. This man is showing you exactly what the restaurant has become. You can be angry at the mirror, or you can look at what it's actually showing you." Vivian sat with that for a long time before she spoke again. "He offered me 60 days, she said at the old rate. "If I meet with him, then go meet with him," Eleanor said. "And Vivian, listen, this time. Actually, listen. Don't walk in already knowing what you're going to say." The meeting happened the following week, not in the property management office, but at Marcus's own request, in his workshop, a converted garage behind his modest single-story house on a quiet residential street that could not have looked more different from the world Vivian had grown up in. Sawdust on the floor. Tools organized on a pegboard with a precision that looked almost architectural. A child's bicycle leaning against the wall, streamers still on the handlebars. Marcus was sanding down a small wooden step stool when she arrived, something clearly meant for a child, unhurried, careful, checking the surface with his palm between passes. "Ellie's growing out of the one she has," he said, without looking up, as if continuing a conversation they'd already been having. "Figured I'd make the next one instead of buying it." Vivian stood in the doorway for a moment, feeling, for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit, entirely out of her depth in a room that had nothing expensive in it at all. "I talked to my mother," she said. Marcus set down the sandpaper. "She built the restaurant so people like you throughout last week would have somewhere to go." Vivian continued, "I think I forgot that a long time ago. I think I forgot it so slowly I didn't notice I'd forgotten it." Marcus didn't say anything. Triumphant, he didn't say "I told you so," or anything close to it. He simply nodded, once, the way a man nods when a measurement finally comes back correct after being wrong twice. "What do you want to do about it?" he said. "I don't know yet," Vivian admitted. "I know I don't want to be the person who did what I did last week. Not because it's bad for business, because it was cruel, and I didn't even clock it as cruel in the moment. That scares me more than the rent does." "Good," Marcus said. "That's the part that matters," he told her. Then, plainly, without softening it and without piling on, exactly what he'd observed in his years owning small commercial spaces, watching businesses succeed and fail around him. That the restaurants that lasted were the ones that treated every person who walked through the door as if they might become a regular, not the ones that treated regulars as a shield against everyone else. At policies, built on appearance instead of behavior, always eventually caught an innocent person in their teeth, the way they'd caught him and Ellie. That reputation, real reputation, the kind that outlives a single bad review or a single ugly night, was built on how you treated people when you had every excuse and every incentive not to. Vivian listened. Actually listened, the way her mother had told her to. "I'd like to make this right," she said finally. "Not just with the rent, with Ellie, if that's even something you'd allow." Marcus considered this for a long moment. "She still talks about the crown," he said. "Not angry about it anymore. Kids process things quick when the adults around them handle it right, but she remembers it. Would you let me apologize to her? Properly, not as a photo opportunity, just as the truth." "If it's real," Marcus said, "and not for your image, then yes. She'd probably like that, but I'll know if it's not real. And so will she, eventually, even if it takes her longer." "It's real," Vivian said, and for the first time since the night she'd had a man and his daughter thrown out of her restaurant, she meant something completely without a performance sitting underneath it. The following Saturday, Cross and Vine was closed to the public for the afternoon, and Ellie Webb sat at the best table in the house, wearing a new paper crown she'd made herself that morning because she'd decided the old one didn't feel special anymore after everything that happened, in a dress her father had let her pick out, with a slice of chocolate lava cake in front of her that the pastry chef had made twice. The second time, from scratch, because the first attempt hadn't been perfect enough for what this needed to be. Vivian knelt down beside the table, at eye level with the 7-year-old, which was not a posture she'd have thought to take 6 months earlier. "I made a mistake," Vivian said. "A big one. I judged your dad by his clothes instead of paying attention to who he actually is, and it hurt your birthday, and that wasn't fair to you. I'm sorry. Really sorry. Not just saying it, because grown-ups are supposed to." Ellie considered this, with the serious, uncomplicated fairness that only children seem to manage without effort. "Is the cake good this time?" she asked. "I think it's the best one we've ever made," Vivian said. "Okay," Ellie said, and took a bite. And that, as far as Ellie Webb was concerned, closed the matter entirely. Marcus watched, from a few feet away, arms loosely crossed, something in his posture looser than it had been in the property office. He caught Vivian's eye once briefly, and gave her the smallest nod, an acknowledgement that cost nothing and meant more than a paragraph of forgiveness could have. Over the following months, the changes at Cross and Vine were not loud ones. There was no press release, no rebrand, no clever marketing campaign built around redemption. Because Vivian understood by then, the way her mother had always understood, that the kind of change that mattered didn't need an audience to be real. She rewrote the staff handbook herself, removing every clause that referenced appearance-based judgment calls at the door, replacing them with clear behavioral standards that applied equally to everyone regardless of what they were wearing. She sat in on front-of-house training, personally for the first time in 3 years. She started keeping a standing table reserved every Friday night, at no charge for a rotating list of people the kitchen staff nominated, nurses coming off double shifts, retired regulars on fixed incomes, a firefighter who'd once eaten there on his wedding anniversary before his wife passed and never came back because he couldn't afford it alone. Nobody outside the restaurant knew about that table. It wasn't for anyone outside the restaurant to know. Eleanor Cross visited twice in the following year, wheeled in through the front door she hadn't walked through in 3 years, and sat at her old corner table, watching her daughter run the floor the way she used to, and said very little, because there wasn't much left to say that the room itself wasn't already saying. Marcus renegotiated the lease at the end of the 60 days, not back down to what it had been, because that wouldn't have been fair to his other tenants either, but to a rate slightly below the block's true market average. A quiet, unannounced gesture that Vivian only fully understood the shape of a year later. When she finally saw what comparable spaces 2 blocks over were charging, he never mentioned it. She never asked him to explain it. That was, in its own way, exactly the kind of thing the two of them had learned to do with each other by then. Marcus kept doing what he'd always done. He still showed up to job sites in his work boots. He still ran Webb Restoration with the same 9 employees, still checked every measurement twice, still turned down interviews from a regional business journal that wanted to profile the low-key holding company owner who'd quietly bought up half a city block. He didn't need the recognition. He'd never built any of it for recognition. What did change slowly, without either of them naming it out loud for a long time, was that Vivian started showing up at the little corner pizza place near Cross and Vine on Friday evenings, the one with the broken jukebox that still lit up, where Marcus and Ellie had their standing tradition of pizza night. She didn't come every week, at first. Then she did. Ellie started saving her a seat before she arrived, without being asked to, and started drawing her things too. Crooked crayon renderings of the 3 of them at a red vinyl booth, which Vivian kept, every single one, in a drawer at home she didn't show anyone. Marcus didn't rush any of it. He wasn't a man who rushed things. He'd learned a long time ago that the things worth building, a business, a home, trust, between 2 people who'd started on opposite sides of a very ugly moment, all needed the same thing. Good construction needed time, attention, a willingness to check your work twice before you called it finished. One evening, almost a year after the night Ellie had worn her first paper crown into a restaurant that turned her away, the 3 of them sat together at that same red vinyl booth, and Ellie, mouthful of pizza, looked up at both of them with the plain, devastating honesty only children seem able to afford. "Are you my mom now?" she asked Vivian. The booth went quiet for a second. Marcus didn't jump in to soften it or redirect it. He let the question sit in the air the way he let every difficult thing sit until it had been properly looked at. Vivian looked at Ellie, and then, briefly, at Marcus, who gave her nothing but an open, patient expression, the same one he'd worn behind the desk the day she walked into his office, ready for a fight she never got to have. 2. "I don't know yet, sweetheart," Vivian said carefully, honestly. "But I'd like to keep coming to pizza night, if that's all right with you. And we'll figure the rest out together. No rush?" "Okay," Ellie said, entirely satisfied with that answer, and went back to her pizza, because as far as she was concerned, the important part, the part about whether Vivian would keep showing up, had already been settled. Marcus reached over and adjusted the paper crown Ellie still insisted on wearing to pizza night, out of habit now more than ceremony, tilting it until it sat straight on her head. The exact same motion he'd made outside Cross and Vine on the worst night of her 7th year. Some things about him hadn't changed at all and never would. He still checked things twice. He still didn't raise his voice when it mattered most. He still measured what a person was worth by how they treated someone who couldn't do anything for them, not by what they wore or what they owned or what letters came after their name. The block he'd bought quietly, without anyone knowing his name attached to it, had ended up teaching more than one person something about what actually holds a life together. Not the marble countertops, not the gold lettering on the door, not the size of the number on a lease, just the plain, unglamorous discipline of doing right by people, especially the ones who never find out you had the power to do otherwise.